Okay, guys, here we go. We're going to finish this thing up. Your three questions are going to be number one, how is the quote, "This is what Christians mean by God," unquote, related to God's name as revealed to Moses? I am who I am. So I'm going to email you this. I might not even put the words up if I'm in a hurry to finish this up, but I'll attach these questions. Number two, the medievals, people who lived in the Middle Ages, said, quote, "Being is knowable," unquote. How is it related to this statement? Quote, "Science would never get off the ground unless its practitioners believed this mystical principle," unquote. And the third and last question for you to send to Caleb is, what is God? All right, there you go. You guys have a blessed week, and I hope to see you all Sunday.
In affirming that God is not a being, I've certainly held off idolatry, but have I left us thereby in an intellectual lurch, doomed simply to remain silent about God? If God cannot be in any sense defined, how do we explain the plethora of theological books and arguments? After all, the same Thomas Aquinas who said that God cannot be placed in any genus also wrote millions of words about God. The 33rd chapter of the book of Exodus gives us a clue as to the resolution of this dilemma. Moses passionately asks God to reveal his glory to him, and Yahweh acquiesces. The Lord specifies, saying, "I will make all my goodness pass before you, but you cannot see my face, for no one shall see me and live." God then tells Moses that while the divine glory passes by, God will place his servant in the cleft of a rock and cover Moses' eyes. "Only then," he says, "will I take away my hand, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen." God can indeed be seen in this life, but only indirectly, through his creatures and effects. We can understand him, but only obliquely, glimpsing him, as it were, out of the corners of our eyes. We see his back, as it's disclosed in the beauty, the intelligibility, and the contingency of the world that he's made. I first encountered Thomas Aquinas' arguments for God's existence when I was 14, and the experience changed my life. They gave me a sense of the reality of God that I've never lost. Thomas formulated those 5 arguments for God's existence when he was here at the Dominican convent of Santa Sabina in Rome. They say that Thomas would walk at high speed around this cloister when he was deep in thought. He gave us 5 arguments. I'll just develop one of them. The one I think is the most fundamental, the most basic. It's called the argument from contingency. Contingency is something that's really part of our very ordinary experience. It names the fact that things come into being and they pass out of being. Think for a second of a great, majestic summer cloud that billows up and then fades away in the course of a lazy August afternoon. It comes into being, and then in a very evanescent way, it passes out of being. Now think of all the plants and flowers that have grown up and then withered and faded. Think of all the human beings who have come and gone. Psalm 90 says, Lord, teach us to remember the shortness of our lives, that we're like grass that grows in the morning and by evening withers and fades. The Psalm says, our lives are over like a sigh. Even those things that seem so permanent. Think of a great mountain range like the Rocky Mountains. If we had over the many eons and millennia a time-lapse camera that could film the emergence of the Rocky Mountains, their endurance for a long period of time, and then their erosion, and then we speeded up that film, the Rocky Mountains would look for all the world like that fleeting summer cloud. Well, that's the starting point of Thomas's proof. Things come into being and they pass out of being. And this means something. It means they don't carry within themselves the reason for their own existence. We have to explain them by appeal to an extrinsic cause. So, go back to that summer cloud. You say, well, what causes it to be? Well, you mentioned the moisture in the air, you mentioned the wind, you mentioned the atmosphere, and that's fair enough as far as it goes. But as any meteorologist will tell you, those things too are contingent. They come into being and pass away. So you go a step further and you say, well, they're caused by the jet stream, which is caused by the movement of the planet. Oh, but the planet itself is contingent. Scientists tell us it came into being 4 billion years ago, and it too will one day pass away. Okay, another step. The planet's caused by, events within the solar system, within the galaxy. But those too change, coming into being and passing out of being. So you say, okay, they're all grounded in the great structures of the universe. Scientists have told us the universe itself came into being 13 billion years ago through the Big Bang. Here's the point. We have still not explained the existence of that summer cloud. Aquinas concludes, if we are to avoid an infinite regress, which finally explains nothing at all, we must come finally to some reality which does exist through itself. We must come finally to some necessary being whose very nature it is to be. This, he says, is what people mean by God. Then he makes this connection. Keep that proof in mind, and then remember the answer that Moses got when he asked God. If they ask for your name, what will I tell them? And the Lord responded, I am who I am. Not one being among many, not one contingent reality among many. But God says, on Thomas's reading, I am the one whose very nature it is to be. This is what Christians mean by God. In 1968, a young German theology professor named Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, wrote a book entitled Introduction to Christianity. In the course of that book, Ratzinger formulated a neat argument for God's existence, one that I believe is especially relevant to our time, when religion and science are so often set in opposition to each other. Ratzinger begins with the observation that finite being as we experience it is marked through and through by intelligibility, by a formal structure that makes it capable of being known by an inquiring mind. The medievals had a dictum, ens est scibile, being is knowable. In point of fact, no science would ever get off the ground unless its practitioners believed this mystical principle. How could a psychologist go out to meet the psyche with confidence unless he thought it was marked by intelligibility? How could the physicist go out to meet the physical world unless he was convinced that through and through it is knowable? I know no other place on earth that better exemplifies the harmony of religion and science than the Vatican Observatory, perched on a high mountain outside of Tucson, Arizona. Now, Ratzinger argues that the only finally satisfying explanation for this universal objective intelligibility is some great subjective intelligence, some mind which has thought the universe into being. Our language gives us a rather intriguing clue in this regard. For we speak of our acts of knowledge as moments of recognition, recognition, literally thinking again what has already been thought. Ratzinger cites Einstein himself in support of this proposition. The great scientist said, "In the laws of nature, a mind so superior is revealed that in comparison to it, our minds count as something worthless." In the prologue to his gospel, St. John says, "In the beginning was the Word." His Greek term is logos, which could just as well be translated as mind. He then specifies that through this mind, all things came to be. He implies thereby that the universe is not dumbly there, it's intelligently there, having been spoken into being by a great creative mind. The argument offered by Joseph Ratzinger is but a specification of this great revelation. The Bible is not a book of science, it's a book of theology and spirituality. So it's telling in this sort of cosmological myth a great religious truth, which is that God creates the whole universe. All of being comes from God. That's the biblical idea. Now, how that happened precisely, what are the details of it? I won't look to the Bible so much. I'll look to science to explain it. Here's something about the Big Bang that's interesting. Thomas Aquinas was a very honest philosopher. He said, look, I can't prove philosophically that the world had a beginning in time. And so he found other proofs to get to the existence of God. If he had known what we knew, he'd say, it's as easy as pie proving that God exists. Because once you say, hey, the whole world came into being in one big bang, well, it must have had a cause outside of itself. But see, he was so honest. He said, I don't know that in the 13th century. If he knew what we know now, it would have been much easier. So I invoked it there to support his proof, but actually that makes it easier to defend what he was saying. We ask about many things, but there is a particular question that the philosophers call the question after being. It is the inquiry not into this or that particular state of affairs, but rather into the meaning of it all. What is it all about? The Christian answer to that question is love. For love is what God is.